The Washburn Tavern, also known as the Washburn Tavern, has sat on a hill off Route 67 in Oxford since 1714, when John Twitchell built a small house on the property. Around 1741, the Washburn family purchased the property, enlarged the house, and transformed it into a tavern. At one time, it was a stagecoach stop on the Oxford Turnpike, and during the Civil War was a station in the Underground Railroad. Today, the building is home to Cook, Daoud & Associates, a financial advisory branch of American Express. The firm has been at that location for more than 4 years. In 1748, the Reverend Richard Mansfield was ordained an Episcopalian priest by the Archbishop of Canterbury, swearing an allegiance to the King of England. He was then assigned to the Derby parish and lived in this glebe house, a parish residence on Jewett Street in Ansonia, where St. Joseph's Church now stands. Reverend Mansfield was the active rector of St. James Episcopal Church for 72 consecutive years. In 1775, he fled for his life to Long Island after a pro-British letter he wrote fell into the hands of some local patriots. After his return, a guard was posted in the church to make sure he didn't preach against the colonies. The Mansfield House, an 18th century saltbox, was later relocated to its current location across the street and looks much as it did in 1747 when it was purchased by 8 Episcopalian families for the new rector. The Mansfield House is now the property of the Derby Historical Society, but not open at the present time. Reverend Richard Mansfield is buried in Ansonia's Elm Street Cemetery, the original site of his parish church.
At the top of Academy Hill is Derby's oldest remaining home. It was built in 1686 by Samuel Bowers, a constable who was also the town's drummer. About the year 1700, it became the home of Dr. John Durand. Durand was Derby's first physician, a Huguenot who emigrated from France in 1685 and brought the first lilac bushes to this country. Both Bowers and Durand are buried in nearby Colonial Cemetery, which is reputedly the oldest public burial ground in the United States. From 1755 to 1800, Tory sympathizer James Beard was in residence. Legend has it that the house served as British Army headquarters during the Pork Hollow raid into what is now Ansonia. The home is currently referred to as Brownie Castle, after W.S. Brown, who lived there for 50 years. The Red Saltbox House on Academy Hill is now a private residence. The house that the Shelton Historical Society works out of is a piece of local history itself. The Marx Bronson house, built in 1822, was originally owned by Hezekiah Marx, a merchant in the town of Huntington. Around the time of the Civil War, the house passed into the hands of the Bronson family, who would own it for over 100 years. The house has strong federal architectural influences, as well as some early Greek Revival stylings. The center chimney services 5 fireplaces, each with a different surround. A Victorian porch was added during the 1880s, which wrapped around the west side of the house. The last residents of the house were Harry and Gertrude Bronson, who farmed around Huntington Center. Upon Mrs. Bronson's death, the Historical Society obtained the house and in 1971 moved it about a mile away from the current location of Webster Bank to its present home just up the street on Ripton Road.
The Naugatuck Board of Education is currently housed in this historic building, which was home to the prominent Tuttle family from 1880 to 1938. Bronson Beecher Tuttle and his friend J.H. Whittemore expanded his father Eben's iron foundry into the Malleable Iron Foundry. In 1880, Tuttle had architect Robert Wakeman Hill build a mansion of medieval splendor on North Church Street. It was made of pressed Philadelphia brick, with brick walls inside the wood paneling and Minton tiles in the fireplaces. The house cost $50,000, a princely sum for the times. Mr. Tuttle died in 1903, his wife 25 years later. In 1935, the property was given to the town of Naugatuck for the sum of $1 to be used for educational and recreational purposes. In 1938, the Tuttle House was converted to a high school annex and used for some classes at least through 1952. The Naugatuck Board of Education has been working out of the building ever since. From 1804 to 1850, the town of Seymour was known as Humphrey'sville, after General David Humphreys, who established the first factory village in the country near the Seymour Falls. There in 1806, he built a woolen mill, said to be the first of its kind in America. His nephews John and William Humphreys ran the mill, and its financial success led to the town's growth and prosperity. The house on the corner of West and West Church Streets was home to John Humphreys, also known as Judge, who, in addition to running the mill, practiced law. The house was also known as the Sanford Humphreys House. The back portion of the house was built before the Revolutionary War by its original owner, Dr. Samuel Sanford, the town's first physician. On February 20th, 1797, Trinity Episcopal Church was organized in this historic home. Sanford died in 1803, and at some point soon after, General Humphreys added the front section of the house for his nephew, who lived there with his family in the early 19th century.
In 1786, 3 years before George Washington became president, Abel Wheeler built this house on Academy Hill Road in Oxford, which was still part of Derby at the time. The home is located on a hill just northwest of the Oxford Congregational Church, which was built 4 years later in 1790. Although there have been additions to the original, it remains a fine example of colonial architecture. It has its original entrance with a Palladian window above. Abel Wheeler represented Oxford as a member of the Connecticut legislature from 1818 to 1821 and was first master of the Morning Star Lodge. The house was later the residence of Samuel Pierpont Sanford, one of Oxford's most active and successful businessmen. At various times, he was a postmaster, owned a grist mill, and operated a merchant store in Oxford Center, which thrived there for decades. During this time, it was reported that the home was a popular site for social events. In the 1970s, the owners were Alice and Clinton Litchfield. The 218-year-old building currently houses Terry James Art and Frame and Historical Art Gallery.
On the Ansonia-Derby border, at Division, Elm, and South Main Streets, is the birthplace of General William Hull. Hull was the uncle of Commodore Isaac Hull, governor of the state of Michigan, and good friend to fellow Yale student Nathan Hale. General Hull distinguished himself in the Revolutionary War, winning the praise of George Washington and Congress. He was appointed captain of the Derby Company of Volunteers, joining Washington's army at Cambridge and reuniting with Nathan Hale. After Hale's death, it was Hull who transcribed his famous last words for posterity. With Washington, Hull crossed the Delaware River and quartered at Valley Forge. Today, Body Realty occupies the site of the birthplace of General William Hull. Next door on Derby Avenue once stood the home of Claudius Bartholomew, the first Frenchman to settle in this area. The Salt Box House was torn down around 1900, 5 years after this photo was taken. Across the street at 75 Elm is the home Bartholomew built for his son Jared. The story goes that upon Jared's return to Derby from a sea voyage, the Stratford drawbridge was not raised quickly enough for his ship to pass through, so he blasted it with the ship's cannon.
One of the oldest existing homes in Shelton can be found off Meadow Street. Built around 1810 by David Tomlinson, it sits on what once was part of a 250-acre farm that extended from Meadow Street to the Housatonic River. The land was given to Tomlinson by his father, Captain Beach Tomlinson, a captain in the Continental Army. The Tomlinsons, arriving from England in the 1650s, were early settlers of Ripton Parish, part of the city of Shelton. In 1828, David bequeathed the property to his son Gould. The farm stayed in the family until the 1940s, and in 1949 was purchased by John Sensabaugh. In 1980, Sensabaugh sold most of the remaining property to the Shelton Housing Authority to build what is now known as Sensabaugh Heights, a senior housing community. In 1996, Sensabaugh sold the home and remaining property to its current owners, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Anthony. The house is an example of Federal-style architecture, popular from the 1780s to the 1820s. Many of its original features have been retained, including its 9 fireplaces, wide plank floors, windows, and moldings. 250 years ago, Josiah Twitchell of Oxford built this house. Located high on a hill on the corner of Towner Lane and Christian Street, it is referred to as the Roland Homestead House. It is one of the state's most threatened historic places. Developers plan to build a senior community complex on the site, and funds are being raised to move the house to a nearby location. The 2.5-story early colonial has a central chimney and shingled walls. The timber used in its construction was cut and hewn from the virgin forest that surrounded the home. The large planks of oak flooring remain in good condition. The farm was once one of the most productive in town. Josiah Twitchell left the property to his son Jeremy, who spent his whole life on the farm. Jeremy married Anna Candy, the daughter of Caleb Candy, a soldier in the American Revolution. Anna had 9 brothers, all of whom also served in the American Revolution. Among those 9 brothers were Daniel and Job Candy, who built the Oxford House. Another brother, Timothy, built the Oxford Congregational Church. At one point, the farm passed to David Riggs, who married Jeremy's granddaughter, Eunice. Since then, the farm has changed hands many times.
On Caroline Street in Derby stands what was once the home of Dr. John Ireland Howell, physician, inventor, and a founding father of the American Industrial Revolution. Howe experimented on Indian rubber and received a patent for a rubber compound in 1829. Soon after, he constructed a machine that would make straight pins, which were used by seamstresses, tailors, banks, businesses, and the general population. In 1832, Howe obtained a patent for his pin-making machine, and in 1838, he opened a factory where cheap water power was available, in Derby. The Howe Pin Company was located on a canal at the present site of Home Depot. Howe soon had 5 machines in operation, producing 100 tons of pins a year, making the common pin common. One of Howe's machines is currently on display at the Smithsonian Museum. The Howe House was built of stone from a quarry owned by Dr. Howe. The factory was of similar construction and a short walk from his home. Before his death, Dr. Howe raised funds to build a Civil War monument, which still stands over the Derby Green. The Howe House is slated to become the home of the Lower Naugatuck Valley Industrial Heritage Center, which will contain an extensive collection of industrial-era artifacts. Seymour, Connecticut, as it looked in 1872. 13 years later, Austin Goodyear Day, founder of the Keyright Company in Seymour, built a stately home on the grounds of his wire and cable works factory. The Victorian, Gothic, and Queen Anne-style mansion still stands today, in not quite the same bucolic setting as it did then. Austin Goodyear Day was drawn into the study of Indian rubber after gaining employment at his cousin Charles Goodyear's factory. It was in 1854 that Day started an industry that manufactured Keyright, which, when mixed with rubber, gave the product outstanding properties for use in cable and insulated wire. Clear communication from one continent to the other was made possible by Day's submarine telegraph cable. His brother-in-law, Captain William Richard Brixey, was a former seaman who sailed around the world several times before hoisting the anchor for good. He became the plant's supervisor, and after Mr. Day's death in 1889, was given ownership of the plant and took up residence in the Day Mansion. He ran Keyright Telegraph Cable Works until his death in 1911. The well-cared-for home is still in use today. Many door panels and some windows are Tiffany glass. On the first floor is the company's conference room, with a small but luxurious dining area. The second floor serves as a mini museum, paying tribute to the predominant role of Keyright in global communications. In one quarter-mile stretch of Ansonia's Elm Street, once called Old Town Road, there is much history to be found. At the intersection of Division, Derby Avenue, South Main, and Elm, one could start a walking tour. However, be mindful of the incessant traffic on this formerly quiet country lane. At 74 Elm Street, you'll find the Josiah Smith House, built in 1798. Several Josiah Smiths own this house. This large Georgian-style home was later known as the Jonah Platt Place. Almost next door at number 70 is the Hodge House, once owned by prominent citizen Benjamin Hodge. Built by Abel Gunn Jr., a soldier in the French Wars, it's dated 1721, but is believed to have been constructed a decade earlier. Across the street at number 65 is the James Stokes House, built around 1778. It was used as a summer home at one time by Stokes' father-in-law, Anson Green Phelps, the founder of Ansonia. Phelps's daughter, Caroline Phelps Stokes, gave money to the city for the creation of the Ansonia Public Library. Further up and across the street at number 54 is the Blakesley House. Built in 1712 and formerly a salt box house, it was occupied in 1738 by John Holbrook and his wife Abigail, who donated part of their property for the valley's first Episcopal church and town burying ground. In 1792, the Reverend Edward Blakesley owned the house. A resident of this historic graveyard is Blakesley's father-in-law, Reverend Richard Mansfield, who completed the longest Episcopalian pastorate in our country's history, 72 years. Crossing Elm once more, a short walk will take you to number 13, the Riggs House. Built in 1760 for Captain Joseph Riggs, who managed the first lottery in the area, which raised funds to build bridges and highways. Right around the corner at number 3 Elm is the Sheldon Curtis House. Mr. Curtis, who built this house in 1789, was a teacher at the Derby Academy. 4 years later, a new owner used it as an inn and tavern, a popular stop for travelers between New Haven and Points North. Besides these historical homes, there are some half dozen others on Elm Street that date between 1700 and 1830, including the David Humphreys House, built in 1698.
A historic 30-room Victorian mansion sits majestic on Great Hill Road in Oxford. It was once the estate of prominent engineer Stephen Betts Church, who made his fortune with his International Artesian Well Drilling Company. Known as Oxfordshire, the house is approximately 10,000 square feet. The main house was built in 1925, but 2 attached wings that made up the original structure date back to Church's family homestead in 1736. Mr. Church had the old house separated and placed the main structure between the parts, using several architects to accomplish this unusual feat. Entering the front door, visitors will encounter a wide stairway with hand-carved banisters leading to the second-floor sitting room hall. The wraparound windows allowed Mr. Church to sunbathe indoors, listening to music as he lay in a hammock. The living room is big but cozy, filled with leather sofas, antiques, and Mr. Church's original Victrola. The music room is equipped with a piano and an Aeolian player pipe organ. The speaker system allowed music played on the organ to be heard throughout the home. S.B. Church entertained senators, governors, artists, and business people at Oxfordshire. A lifelong bachelor, he often opened his estate to friends and relatives, hosting weddings, birthday parties, and other events. Mr. Church also had the distinction of owning the very first automobile in Oxford. S.B. Church left a third of his estate to Oxford for the construction of a new town hall, the S.B. Church Memorial Town Hall. His fortune also allotted $1 million each to his place of worship and to Griffin Hospital in Derby. The current owners, Paul and Molly Moran, have the house on the market, where it is expected to fetch almost $1 million. The house at 37 Elm Street in Ansonia, referred to in old land records as the Mansion House, dates back to 1698 and was built for the town's ministers. Today, it is known as the David Humphreys House. The attached structure, which served as a summer kitchen, was originally the valley's first Episcopal church, located across the street in the middle of the cemetery until 1800. General David Humphreys was born in the house in 1752. Humphreys, a close friend and advisor to George Washington, was this country's first foreign ambassador and also ran a successful woolen mill in what is now Seymour. The house, recognized as the municipality's oldest structure, is currently home to the Derby Historical Society. It has been restored to its mid-18th century appearance, incorporating elements of lower Naugatuck Valley history from the pre-colonial, Revolutionary, and Federal periods. Now hanging in the pastor's study is a restored oil portrait of David Humphreys, an excellent 1894 copy of a Gilbert Stuart painting. Since its public debut in 1980, the home has been the only museum in the region open on a daily basis, run by a private historical society. As part of the society's Day in 1762 educational program, 5th graders prepare lunch over an open hearth, spin, weave, and learn what life was like when David Humphreys was their age. For more information on the David Humphreys House, please visit www.derbyhistorical.org. The Osborne House in Derby is not merely a historical home, but a museum. Originally a simple farmhouse built around 1840, the Greek Revival-style house was the 1876 birthplace and lifelong home of Frances Osborne Kellogg, who deeded her 350-acre property to the state to form Osbornedale State Park. The Osborne Homestead, with almost all of its original furnishings, has 16 rooms, many filled with Osborne's collections of books, antiques, and fine arts. The dining room, added to the original structure around at the turn of the last century, houses cherished gems of Kellogg, who was an avid collector of pottery and porcelain, including 17th and 18th century Delft and Staffordshire dishes. The main parlor, like the dining room, is fully paneled in the Georgian Revival style. The studio, the last room added to the home, is paneled in black walnut and was built to a different scale from the rest of the house with its tall ceilings and large windows. Between 1910 and 1925, the house was remodeled in the Colonial Revival style. To the exterior, a graceful portico entrance was added, as well as a beautiful solarium overlooking the gardens. The grounds are landscaped with formal flower gardens, ornamental shrubs, and flowering trees. The gardens feature 100 rose bushes, Kellogg's favorite. The garden designs date back to 1911.